It was discovered at that time Terry Bollea, also known as Hulk Hogan, was experiencing a serious medical-related issue. Personnel provided medical treatment at that time and transported Mr. Bollea to Morton Plant Hospital, where he died at 11:17 a.m.
Hulk Hogan spent 40 years as one of the most famous men on the planet, and when he died, we all thought we understood what happened. But what the FBI found inside his Clearwater mansion after his death is something nobody saw coming, and the people who know exactly what it is are not talking. Police officials and nurses who were present that morning have been contacting his own daughter in private, putting their careers on the line, because what happened in that house was never meant to come out, and nothing about how this legend died was as simple as the headline said it was. The morning of July 24th. On the morning of July 24th, 2025, Hulk Hogan was found unresponsive in his Clearwater home. 3 weeks earlier, he had appeared on Fox and Friends to promote Real American Freestyle, the wrestling league he had been building with his longtime friend Eric Bischoff. He walked out with a cane and looked noticeably thinner than he had in years. At the end of the segment, unprompted, he looked into the camera and said, "I need to take a nap, brother. I am totally worn out." Everyone in the room laughed. Nobody took it seriously. Looking back at that moment now, knowing that within 3 weeks he would be dead and federal agents would be pulling apart his home, that throwaway line about needing a nap reads less like a joke and more like a man who already knew something was wrong and had no idea how wrong it was about to get. The day before he died, he posted on Instagram a beach towel printed with his own face, a can of his Real American beer resting in the towel's printed hand, and a caption that read, "Beach Day sponsored by Brotherhood." Even Kevin Nash, one of his oldest friends in the business, said they had been texting 2 days earlier and that Hogan seemed energized, while Nick Hogan, his son, said his father had been counting the days until his wife Sky came home from her wellness retreat. Nobody reading that post had any reason to treat it as a farewell. By the next morning, it was the last thing he ever said to the world. Sky placed the 911 call at 9:51 in the morning. 3 words. He stopped breathing. Not a collapse, not a chest-clutching seizure, just a man who had simply and quietly stopped breathing. And by the time she found him, there was nothing left to do. Paramedics worked the scene and transported him to Morton Plant Hospital, where he was pronounced dead at 11:17 that morning. The cause was listed as acute myocardial infarction, certified by his primary care physician, and with no autopsy performed. By the time the public had processed the news, the body had been cremated and the physical evidence with it. The house was still there, and what investigators found when they walked through the front door did not match a natural death in almost any detail that mattered. But before we get to what they found, you need to understand one thing that happened 2 months earlier, because without it, nothing else in this story makes sense. The surgery nobody talked about. On May 14th, 2025, Hulk Hogan underwent a 4-level anterior cervical discectomy and fusion, a procedure in which surgeons enter the neck, remove damaged discs across 4 vertebral levels, and fuse the bones together to relieve pressure on the spinal nerves. It is among the most complex operations in spine surgery, and at 71 years old with more than 25 prior surgeries behind him, everyone in his inner circle understood the risk. What they did not understand, at least not publicly, was what Hogan himself began to suspect in the weeks after he came home. Medical professionals who reviewed the case after his death focused on a specific concern that never made it into the headlines: the phrenic nerve, the structure that drives the diaphragm and controls the body's ability to breathe, runs directly through the surgical field in a multi-level anterior cervical procedure. Damage to it does not always announce itself on the operating table. It can surface weeks later, quietly, as a respiratory failure with no dramatic presentation and no warning signal that someone nearby would recognize as an emergency. The result is not a heart attack the way people picture one. The result is a person who simply stops breathing. That is exactly how Sky described what she found, and here is the detail that changes everything. In the weeks between that surgery and his death, Hogan had started making calls he had never made before, to people in a world very far removed from professional wrestling. And what those calls reveal about what he suspected is the reason the FBI was inside that house in the first place. Who was he calling and why change all the natural death claims? But before that, what exactly do you think the investigators found the moment they walked through his front door? This truth is more shocking than you think. A house that had been prepared. Hulk Hogan's gym was the room where he was most himself, and even through the surgeries and the recoveries and the seasons when he could barely move without pain, he went back to it, and his son Nick described him in his final months as more focused and disciplined in his training than at any previous point in his life, which is exactly what made what investigators found so difficult to explain. A room that had been used 2 days earlier had no business looking the way it did. Surfaces polished, weights arranged in geometric rows with the uniform spacing of deliberate placement rather than actual use. Floor mats without a single scuff mark, no water bottles, no towels. Someone had been in that gym before the 911 call was made, and whatever they were doing, it was not working out. One of the agents who walked through it reportedly described the space as eerily sterile, almost staged, and that word changed the way they looked at everything else. Then came the security system. Hogan's Clearwater property was equipped with a layered, redundant surveillance network covering every entry point and interior common area, with backup systems designed to hold even through power disruptions. But this entire network had reportedly been disabled from inside the house before the 911 call was placed. There were no signs of forced entry anywhere on the property, which meant whoever disabled it was already inside and already trusted. Local law enforcement looked at both of those details and made a call that tells you everything about how seriously they took the scene. They escalated to the FBI, who arrived with cybercrime specialists, digital forensics units, and smart home analysts whose mandate was to reconstruct every movement inside that property in the hours before the 911 call. They confirmed the shutdown had been performed from inside. They could not confirm who did it. But when they pulled Hogan's phone records and communications, they found something in the 3 days before his death that made the sterile gym and the disabled cameras look like the least alarming part of the whole picture. The call 3 nights before he died. 3 days before he died, Hulk Hogan received a late-night phone call, and Sky Daily's account of how he responded to it is one of the most specific and unsettling details in this entire case. She had never, across all their time together, seen him react the way he reacted to that call. She watched him listen in silence for almost a full minute, say almost nothing in response, and end the call pale and visibly shaking, with the kind of expression she described as genuine, animal fear. The type that cannot be performed or controlled. This was a man who had survived the public collapse of a 24-year marriage, financial ruin, and a depression he later admitted had pushed him close to the edge of not continuing. He had come back from all of it without ever looking afraid. After this call, when she pressed him, he deflected with the practiced precision of someone who had long ago learned to keep certain things entirely sealed. Investigators traced the call and ran straight into a wall. The number was unlisted. The signal had been routed through a chain of servers across multiple countries, each layer stripping away the one before it, and the operation required both technical sophistication and deliberate premeditated effort. This was not a misdial, and it was not someone reaching out casually. Someone had taken careful, layered steps to guarantee that the origin of that conversation could not be identified, and had done it with enough precision that even the FBI's cybercrime division could not reach the end of the trail. The contents of the call are classified within the federal investigation. What investigators did establish is that the call had been placed with deliberate technical sophistication, consistent, according to sources familiar with the investigation, with someone who had reason to know what Hogan had been quietly building for months, and reason to want him aware that they knew. Something that, until the second forensic sweep of that mansion, nobody outside his own private circle knew existed. But before we get to the room, you need to understand one more piece that connects all this together, because the will he signed 2 years before his death and what it did to his own daughter is what ultimately explains why the body camera footage from that morning is still sealed today. The tapes nobody can reach. Brooke Hogan had been estranged from her father for the final 2 years of his life, and the final amendment to his will made that estrangement official in legal language with no ambiguity. Under no circumstances shall Brooke E. Balea or any descendants of Brooke E. Balea be considered a beneficiary, and any reference in the will to his children shall not include her. His son Nick was named the sole beneficiary of an estate valued at approximately $5 million. Brooke said she had asked to be removed herself, that she had called Hogan's financial manager in 2023 and requested it because she was scared of the fighting that would come after his death and did not want any part of it. Under Florida law, every decision about the body, the autopsy, and access to investigation materials rested entirely with Sky Daily as the surviving spouse, which meant Brooke had zero legal standing to demand anything. The will had not been written in a single sitting. Hogan first executed it in 2016 and amended it 5 separate times before the version that removed Brooke was finalized, each revision a quiet adjustment of who he trusted and what he wanted to survive him. What makes the timeline more difficult to set aside is this. According to reports covering the estate, Hogan made significant changes to his financial arrangements in the weeks before his death, including the creation of new offshore trusts and asset transfers that his attorneys have declined to explain publicly. A man restructuring his estate weeks before he dies is not automatically suspicious, but combined with everything else happening inside that house in those final weeks, it stops being a coincidence and starts being a pattern. And patterns are exactly what federal investigators are trained to read. What Brooke did not anticipate was what came after. On August 20th, 2025, she posted publicly that she had been receiving confirmed calls from police officials and nurses who were present the day her father died, telling her she needed to see the body camera footage from that morning and get hold of the 911 tapes, because those materials contained information that could change the narrative the public had been given. She said those same people kept contacting her, putting their careers at risk because they felt they had no other choice. The body camera footage and 911 recordings, she said, were sealed and unavailable through the Freedom of Information Act. The footage stayed locked. The people talking to her stayed anonymous. And the question of what those first responders witnessed that was significant enough to make them contact a grieving estranged daughter in secret has never been answered publicly. Brooke also disputed the leukemia listed on the death certificate, saying she had seen his blood work and questioned why that diagnosis was being cited now in a death certified without an autopsy, for a body already cremated before the questions had fully formed. The physical evidence was gone. But the house was still there. The room was still there. And what was inside it was exactly what the people who made that late-night call 3 days before his death had been hoping would never be found. What he was building before they found it. By the second forensic sweep, the FBI had already established that Hogan underwent a major spinal procedure in May and had, in the assessment of the medical specialists who reviewed his case after his death, suffered damage to the phrenic nerve that his surgical team either missed or did not disclose. He had begun making multiple calls to law firms in Washington and New York in the months before his death, firms that specialize not in entertainment law or personal injury, but in federal criminal defense. The kind of legal architecture you build when you believe you are up against parties with the resources to make a problem disappear quietly. He had received an untraceable call 3 nights before his death that left him visibly afraid for the first time in his wife's memory, and his security system had been disabled before anyone called for help. A man who believes his health is declining naturally does not call federal criminal defense attorneys in the final weeks of his life. But according to sources covering the investigation, that is exactly what Hogan did. And the calls were not exploratory. They were the actions of someone who believed something specific had been done to him, who understood that the people responsible had resources he did not, and who was running out of time to build something that could outlast him. He puts the evidence somewhere nobody can take it from him, makes sure it is organized clearly enough that someone coming in after him can follow it, and on the last day of his life, he goes back to it one final time because the window is closing and he is not willing to let it close yet. That is what the room was, and what investigators found when they opened that folder dated the day before he died confirmed every suspicion they had been carrying since the moment they walked into that eerily sterile gym and found the security cameras already off. Never meant to be found. When the FBI finally opened Hulk Hogan's hidden room, what was inside was never meant to be found. The room allegedly contained a private medical archive that Hogan had reportedly been assembling since shortly after his May surgery. Pre-operative imaging, post-operative scans, and correspondence with specialists he had consulted independently, outside the care of the team that performed the procedure. Notes documenting what sources describe as his growing belief that something had gone wrong on that operating table, specifically that his phrenic nerve had been compromised, and that the team responsible either did not catch it in time or chose not to disclose it. Communications with contacts whose names do not appear anywhere in his public life. People he had reportedly been speaking with about his options, about what could be proven, and about what happens to people who try to prove something against parties with enough power to make that difficult. The folder dated the day before his death contained what investigators believed to be the most recently added material, organized with the kind of deliberateness that suggests a person who knew exactly what they were doing and why. Based on what was reportedly inside it, Hogan spent part of his last day alive consolidating the most critical documents, making sure the case he had been building was complete enough to survive him if he ran out of time to finish it himself. The calls to federal criminal defense attorneys were reportedly part of the same effort. The untraceable call 3 nights before, sources suggest, came from parties who allegedly had reason to know what he was building and reason to want it stopped before it could reach anyone in a position to act on it. Sky Daily's medical malpractice lawsuit, if it proceeds to discovery, will force into the public record the exact category of documentation Hogan spent his final months assembling in a room nobody was supposed to find. That process is ongoing. The body camera footage from that morning is still sealed. The 911 tapes are still locked. The professionals who were present that day and who have been reaching out to Brooke are still anonymous, and the FBI has confirmed only that the investigation remains open and that no final conclusion regarding foul play has been reached. Not ruled out, not proven, but open. And Sky's case is not the only legal battle in motion. Nick Hogan, acting as representative for his father's estate, has filed a federal lawsuit in Florida against radio host Todd Clem, better known as Bubba the Love Sponge, to block the release of an unauthorized documentary about his father that Clem had been quietly planning and moved to release the moment Hogan died and could no longer stop it himself. Clem was one of Hogan's closest friends for decades. He is the same person who publicly claimed Hogan was in a coma weeks before his death, and now the same person whose plans to profit from Hogan's most private material activated the moment he was gone. What Clem knew when he knew it, and why he was already prepared to move that fast, is a question the lawsuit has not yet answered. Hulk Hogan spent 40 years performing the role of a man who could not be beaten, and in the final months of his life, in a room in his own basement that nobody was supposed to know existed, he was still fighting, not for a crowd, not for a title, but for the truth about what had been done to him and for the chance that it might outlast him. Whether it will is the question. The federal investigation has not yet closed, the footage is still sealed, the files are still being reviewed, and the people who know what those body cameras captured are still out there. Drop your theory in the comments because this story is not over, and when the next piece surfaces, you will want to have been here from the start. The FBI does not respond to heart attacks, but when Hulk Hogan was found dead on July 24, 2025, federal agents arrived at his Clearwater mansion with cybercrime specialists and digital forensics units. They found a room behind a wall that appeared on no architectural record, and the people who were present when he died have been contacting his own daughter in private, telling her the story the public was given is not complete. What was inside that room was never meant to be found. Do you think what's in those sealed tapes changes everything?